Hi, I'm Sophia. My parents told me there wasn't a seat left for me at their luxury charity gala, but I could see the ballroom through the glass doors. 200 guests, crystal chandeliers, and a reserved table with my nameplate face down on the white linen. My mother looked me dead in the eye and said, "Darling, did you honestly think you belonged here?" That night, I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I simply walked up to the event coordinator and said, "Could you please let the owner know that Sophia Blackwell has arrived?" They all laughed, my parents, my sister, even the security guard. But then the most beautiful man in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo walked out of the VIP section, took my hand, and kissed it gently. "My love," he said, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent entrance hall. "I've been waiting for you." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This isn't just a story about revenge, though there's plenty of that. This isn't just about family drama, though you'll get enough to last a lifetime. This is about the moment when everything you thought you knew about power, about worth, about who gets to decide where you belong, gets turned completely upside down. And it all started with a single text message that arrived at exactly the wrong time. Or maybe, looking back now, exactly the right time. You see, my family, the Blackwells, have been Meridian Heights royalty for 3 generations. My grandfather built half the city's most prestigious buildings. My father sits on every board that matters. My mother chairs the committees that decide who's in and who's out of high society. And my sister Victoria? She's the golden child who married into old money and never lets anyone forget it. Then there's me, Sophia, the family disappointment who chose art school over business school, who lives in a converted warehouse instead of the family estate, who dates inappropriate men and wears vintage instead of designer. For 28 years, I've been the footnote in the Blackwell legacy, the daughter they love, they claim, but somehow never quite fits into their perfectly orchestrated world. Every family photo, every social event, every milestone celebration, I'm either forgotten entirely or included as an afterthought, like a charity case they're obligated to help. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight was the annual Meridian Heights Children's Foundation Gala, the biggest social event of the year, held at the newly renovated Grandview Manor, the most exclusive venue in the city. Tonight was where the city's elite gathered to see and be seen, to write checks with more zeros than most people see in a lifetime, and to reinforce the invisible lines that separate the worthy from the rest. And tonight, for the first time in my adult life, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd finally earned my place at their table. You want to know why I thought that? Because 6 months ago, I did something that should have changed everything. Something that should have made them see me differently. Something that should have proven, once and for all, that I wasn't the failure they'd always believed me to be. But instead of celebrating what I'd accomplished, they decided it was easier to pretend it never happened. Instead of acknowledging what I'd become, they chose to keep seeing me as the disappointment I used to be. And that choice, that willful blindness, was about to cost them everything. Because here's what my family didn't know as they sipped champagne and networked with Meridian Heights' finest. Their unsuccessful daughter, the one who embarrassed them with her unconventional choices, the one who never quite measured up to their impossible standards, had spent the last 2 years building something extraordinary. Something that would make their precious social connections look like child's play. Something that would turn their carefully constructed hierarchy on its head. They thought they knew me. They thought they knew my story. They thought they could write me off, write me out, and face no consequences for treating their own daughter like a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong party. They were wrong. Tonight, in front of 200 of the most influential people in the city, they were about to learn that underestimating Sophia Blackwell was the biggest mistake of their lives. Tonight, They were about to discover that the daughter they'd been hiding from their social circle wasn't just worthy of a seat at their table. She owned the entire damn venue, and the man they'd dismissed as another one of my inappropriate boyfriends, the one they'd refused to meet, refused to acknowledge, refused to include in their family gatherings. He wasn't just my fiancé. He was Elias Montenegro, heir to the Montenegro hospitality empire, owner of Grandview Manor, and as of tonight, the man who would decide whether the Blackwell family would ever be welcome in Meridian Heights high society again. So buckle up, because this story has more twists than a mountain highway, more drama than a soap opera, and more satisfaction than watching someone who really, really deserves it finally get what's coming to them. By the end of this, you'll understand why family approval isn't worth sacrificing your self-respect, and why sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's success so undeniable that your enemies have no choice but to acknowledge it. Are you ready to see what happens when the invisible daughter finally steps into the spotlight? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The notification chimed on my phone at exactly 3:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon, just as I was putting the finishing touches on a sculpture commission that would pay my rent for the next 3 months. My hands were still covered in clay when I glanced at the screen, expecting maybe a text from Elias about dinner plans or a reminder from my gallery about the upcoming exhibition. Instead, it was an Instagram story from my sister Victoria. The kind of perfectly curated post that she specialized in. All soft lighting and expensive everything. But this one made my stomach drop. The image showed an elegant cream-colored invitation with gold-embossed lettering. The annual Meridian Heights Children's Foundation Gala, tomorrow night, at Grandview Manor. And there, in Victoria's perfectly manicured hand holding the invitation, I could see not one, but 4 place cards fanned out like a poker hand she was about to play. Family night out. So excited for tomorrow's gala, with Mom, Dad, and James. The Blackwell table is going to be absolutely stunning. Meridian Heights Elite. Yard Charity Gala. Family first. I stared at that screen until my eyes watered, reading and rereading those place cards. Mr. Richard Blackwell, Mrs. Catherine Blackwell, Mr. and Mrs. James Whitmore, that was Victoria and her husband. 4 cards, 4 seats, 4 family members. I wasn't there. I set my phone down on the clay-covered table and walked to my bathroom, washing the red earth from my hands with the kind of mechanical precision you use when your brain is trying to process something that doesn't quite make sense. The water ran brown, then clear, but I kept scrubbing, kept trying to wash away the feeling that was crawling up my throat. I picked up my phone again. Maybe I'd missed something. Maybe there was a 5th card I hadn't seen. Maybe this was just... The first batch in mine was coming separately. But no. The story was still there, and I could see it clearly now. Victoria had arranged the 4 place cards in a perfect fan, like she was showing off a royal flush. 4 elegant cards with 4 familiar names laid out against the ivory invitation like a family portrait that somehow didn't include me. I opened my messages. Nothing from my parents. Nothing from Victoria. Nothing about a gala. Nothing about tomorrow night. Nothing about the biggest social event of the year that apparently my entire family would be attending. Without me. My finger hovered over my mother's. Contact. Catherine Blackwell. Mom in my phone, though the word felt strange now. I could call her. I could ask about it. I could give her the chance to explain, to tell me it was an oversight, to apologize and scramble to get me included. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the way Victoria had captioned the post. Family night out. Like family was something finite, something that could be contained in exactly 4 place cards and no more. I scrolled back through Victoria's recent posts instead. Last month's country club brunch, photos of her, Mom, and Dad at their usual table. The caption, quality family time. 2 weeks ago, Dad's birthday dinner at Chez Laurent, the three of them raising champagne glasses. Celebrating the best father with my favorite people. I kept scrolling, going back months, looking for myself in these perfectly curated family moments. A glimpse of my face at Christmas dinner. My hand reaching for something in the background of Easter brunch. Always peripheral, always optional. Always the person who could be cropped out without affecting the composition. But this was different. This wasn't a casual dinner or a spur-of-the-moment gathering. This was the Meridian Heights Children's Foundation Gala. This was the event my mother had chaired for the past 5 years. This was the event my father helped organize through his position on the foundation board. This was their event, the crown jewel of their social calendar, and they had deliberately chosen not to include me. I walked to my kitchen and made tea, the kind of Earl Grey my grandmother used to serve when I was little, and spent weekends at the family estate. Before I got too old, too disappointing, too much trouble to include in family photos. The bergamot scent filled my converted warehouse apartment, so different from the crystal and mahogany world where I'd grown up. My phone buzzed again. Another Instagram notification. This time it was my mother's account, rarely used but maintained for the appearances that mattered so much to her. She'd shared Victoria's story to her own account, adding her own caption. Looking forward to a beautiful evening with my beautiful family, so proud of my children. My children, plural, as if I didn't exist. I sat on my vintage velvet couch, the one Victoria had once described as very you, darling, in that tone that made it clear very you was not a compliment, and stared at that post. So proud of my children. Children who apparently numbered exactly 1, despite the fact that she'd given birth to 2 daughters. That's when I noticed the timestamp on the original invitation. The gala was tomorrow night. Saturday evening, 7 p.m. cocktails, 8 p.m. dinner. They had planned this. They had received these invitations weeks ago, maybe months. They had RSVP'd for a table, requested seating arrangements, chosen their outfits. And in all that time, in all those weeks of planning and anticipation, not one of them had thought to mention it to me, or worse. And this thought hit me like ice water. They had thought about it. They had made a conscious decision not to include me. They had looked at their invitation, seen that they could bring family members, and decided that I didn't qualify. I Googled the event. The Meridian Heights Children's Foundation Gala, hosted at the newly renovated Grandview Manor, was sold out. Tickets were $500 per person, tables of 8 starting at $5,000. It was black tie, exclusive, and attended by everyone who mattered in our city's social hierarchy. And there, in the list of table sponsors, I saw it. The Blackwell Family Table, $8,000, supporting educational initiatives for underprivileged children. The Blackwell Family Table, for 4 people. As if their family had always been exactly that size. I set my phone down and walked to my bedroom, where a black evening gown hung in my closet, a vintage Halston I'd found at an estate sale and had tailored to fit perfectly. I'd bought it months ago for a gallery opening that never happened, but it was gorgeous and made me feel like the kind of woman who belonged at elegant events. Tomorrow night, I was going to find out exactly where I belonged. Because here's what. My family didn't know as they planned their perfect evening without me. I had my own invitation to that gala. I had my own connection to Grandview Manor, and I had my own plans for how the evening would unfold. They wanted a family photo that didn't include me. They were about to get one they'd never forget. Sitting there with my lukewarm Earl Grey, staring at that perfect family tableau that somehow didn't include me, I realized this wasn't the first time I'd been edited out of the Blackwell narrative. It was just the most expensive time. My mind drifted back to Victoria's engagement party 3 years ago. I'd found out about it the same way, through social media. Not an Instagram story that time, but a Facebook event that half of Meridian Heights had been invited to? Victoria Blackwell and James Whitmore engagement celebration at the country club, with 150 guests confirmed attending. I'd scrolled through the guest list, looking for my name, assuming there'd been some technical glitch when I didn't receive an invitation. When I finally called my mother to ask about it, her response had been swift and surgical. "Oh, darling, we thought you were still in your experimental phase. We didn't want to put you in an uncomfortable position with our friends." My experimental phase. That's what she called the 2 years I'd spent traveling through Europe, studying art restoration in Florence, learning pottery in the Greek islands, and generally living the kind of life that didn't fit into their carefully planned social calendar. But I'd come home for that engagement party anyway, showing up in a vintage Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress that had cost me a month's rent, determined to be the supportive sister. I'd walked into that country club ballroom and watched my mother's face cycle through surprise, embarrassment, and finally resignation as she introduced me to people as our other daughter, in a tone that suggested I was more of a geological curiosity than a family member. That night, I'd stood by the bar nursing a single glass of champagne that I'd made last 2 hours, watching Victoria float through the crowd in her perfect Marchesa gown, accepting congratulations and admiration, while I remained invisible in the corner. Every family photo taken that evening somehow managed to be snapped when I was in the bathroom, or getting another drink, or just happened to be standing outside the frame. It wasn't malicious, I'd told myself then. It was just logistics. But then there was Christmas last year. The annual Blackwell Christmas Eve dinner at the family estate, a tradition that went back to my great-grandmother's time. Every year, my mother would have the dining room table set with her grandmother's. Haviland china, the good crystal, and place cards written in her elegant calligraphy. The same seating arrangement every year. My father at the head, my mother at the foot, Victoria and James to Dad's right, and me to Mom's left. Except last year, when I'd arrived with a homemade chocolate tart and a bottle of vintage champagne. I'd saved for months to afford. I'd found the table set for 4. Not 5, 4. "Oh," my mother had said when she saw me standing in the doorway, still holding my coat and my carefully chosen contributions to the meal. "Sophia, I thought you were spending Christmas with that artist friend of yours in Portland." I hadn't told her I was spending Christmas in Portland. I hadn't mentioned any artist friend. I had, however, confirmed my attendance 3 weeks prior when she'd asked about Christmas plans during one of our stilted monthly phone calls. "No, Mom," I'd said, setting down my purse and the champagne. "I'm here. I've been coming to Christmas Eve dinner for 28 years. The awkward silence that followed was broken only by Victoria emerging from the kitchen in a cream cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "Oh, Sophia, what a surprise," she'd said, in exactly the same tone people use when they run into their high school math teacher at the grocery store. They'd scrambled to set another place, of course, found another chair from the study, grabbed mismatched silverware from the everyday drawer, squeezed me in between the sideboard and Victoria's chair like an afterthought. But the damage was done. I wasn't expected. I wasn't planned for. I wasn't really wanted. That was the night I'd started to understand that my place in the Blackwell family was conditional, temporary, subject to change based on their convenience and their social calendar. The pattern became clearer once I started looking for it. The family vacation to Martha's Vineyard 2 summers ago, the one I'd found out about through Victoria's Instagram stories of pristine beaches and lobster dinners. When I'd asked about it later, Dad had said, "We thought you'd be too busy with your art projects to join us." I hadn't had any art projects that summer. I'd been working double shifts at the gallery and sleeping on my friend Marcus's couch because I couldn't afford my rent. The Mother's Day brunch at the Meridian Heights Country Club, where they'd reserved a table for 3 and looked genuinely startled when I showed up with flowers for Mom. "How thoughtful, darling," she'd said, accepting the peonies I'd chosen so carefully. "Though you really didn't need to come. I know how difficult it is for you to get time off from whatever it is you're doing these days." whatever it is you're doing these days. As if my life was so incomprehensible, so far removed from their understanding, that they couldn't even categorize it properly. And then there were the smaller moments. The family group chat that I somehow never got added to, despite Victoria regularly referencing conversations we had that I'd never been part of. The birthday dinners planned around my presumed unavailability. The holiday card photo sessions, scheduled for days when I was conveniently working or traveling or otherwise occupied. Each incident by itself could be explained away. Miscommunication, poor timing, honest mistakes. But together, they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. I wasn't being accidentally excluded. I was being systematically erased. The most painful part wasn't even the exclusion itself. It was the gaslighting that came with it. Every time I'd tried to address it, I was met with wide-eyed innocence and concerned suggestions that maybe I was being too sensitive or reading too much into things. Victoria's specialty was the wounded response. "I can't believe you'd think, we do that on purpose. We love you, Sophia. You're family." But love, I was learning, didn't automatically translate to inclusion. And family, apparently, was something that could be redefined at will to suit their narrative. The breaking point had come 6 months ago at Dad's 60th birthday party. Another event I'd learned about through social media, another evening where I'd shown up uninvited but determined to be present for my father's milestone birthday. I'd spent weeks creating a custom piece for him, a bronze sculpture inspired by his love of sailing, something personal and meaningful that I'd poured my heart into. When I'd arrived at the private dining room they'd reserved at Chez Laurent, the finest restaurant in Meridian Heights, I'd found them already seated at a table clearly set for 4. The same 4 place settings, the same 4 family members, the same surprised faces when I appeared with my gift and my hopeful smile. "Sophia," Dad had said, standing up to hug me. "What a wonderful surprise. Though I'm not sure if we can get another chair." The maitre d' had accommodated us, of course. They'd squeezed another chair in, brought another place setting, made space for the daughter who apparently hadn't been expected at her own father's birthday celebration. But as I'd sat there, wedged between a pillar and Victoria's purse, watching them continue their conversation about family friends and social obligations that I knew nothing about, I'd realized something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't part of their family anymore. Not really. I was a guest they felt obligated to include when I forced the issue, but I wasn't someone they thought to invite in the first place. That night, I'd made a decision. I was done forcing myself into spaces where I wasn't wanted. I was done begging for scraps of inclusion from people who'd already decided I didn't belong. I was done being the family disappointment, the experimental daughter, the afterthought in expensive restaurants. I was going to build something they couldn't ignore. And tomorrow night, at the Meridian Heights Children's Foundation Gala, they were going to discover exactly what I'd been building while they'd been so busy pretending I didn't exist. I set my phone face down on the coffee table and walked to the wall of windows that faced west toward downtown Meridian Heights. The sun was setting behind the glass towers, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose gold that would have made a beautiful photograph if I'd had the emotional capacity to appreciate beauty in that moment. Instead, I stood there feeling something crystallize inside me. Not anger, not hurt, but something colder and infinitely more powerful. Clarity. For 28 years, I'd been playing by their rules. Showing up when I wasn't invited, trying to fit into spaces that had been deliberately designed without me in mind, making myself smaller and quieter and more palatable in the hopes that eventually they'd remember I was their daughter too. I'd been the family's ghost, haunting their perfect occasions with my inconvenient presence, hoping that persistence would eventually translate to belonging. But ghosts, I realized as I watched the city lights begin to twinkle below, don't change anything. They just make people uncomfortable until they find ways to pretend they don't exist. I was done being a ghost. I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the vintage Halston gown I'd been saving for a special occasion. Black silk jersey that moved, like water, cut on the bias to skim my figure without clinging, with a neckline that was elegant rather than provocative. It was the kind of dress that whispered rather than shouted, that commanded attention through sheer sophistication rather than desperate attempts to be noticed. Tomorrow night, I wouldn't be sneaking in through side doors or squeezing myself into hastily rearranged seating charts. Tomorrow night, I would walk through the front entrance of Grandview Manor like I owned the place, because in a way, I did. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. While my family had been busy excluding me from their social calendar, I'd been building something they couldn't even comprehend. 6 months ago, while they were planning Dad's birthday dinner without me, I'd been in conference rooms with lawyers and investors, putting together the deal that would change everything. It had started almost by accident. My art had been gaining recognition, slowly, quietly, but steadily. Gallery showings in Portland, a piece purchased by a collector in Seattle, commissions from people who appreciated work that had soul rather than just market appeal. But the real breakthrough had come when I'd been commissioned to create a sculpture for the lobby of a new boutique hotel. That's when I'd met Elias Montenegro. He'd walked into my studio on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, not to inspect my progress on the commissioned piece, but because he'd seen my other work and wanted to understand. The artist behind it, tall, with dark hair and the kind of presence that made rooms feel smaller, he'd spent 2 hours examining my sculptures, asking questions that revealed he understood art not as decoration, but as expression. "You see stories in metal and stone," he'd said, running his fingers along the curves of a piece I'd been working on for months. "Most people see pretty objects. You see souls." That afternoon had led to dinner. Dinner had led to long conversations about art and business and the way beautiful spaces could make people feel more human. Those conversations had led to something I'd never expected to find: partnership, both personal and professional. Elias wasn't just the heir to the Montenegro hospitality empire. He was a visionary who understood that luxury wasn't about exclusion, but about creating experiences so beautiful they elevated everyone who encountered them. When he'd inherited Grandview Manor, a historic estate that had fallen into disrepair, he'd seen not just a restoration project, but an opportunity to redefine what elegant hospitality could be. And he'd wanted me to be part of that vision, not as decoration, not as arm candy to complete his image, but as a creative partner whose artistic vision could help transform the manor into something unprecedented. We'd spent months planning the renovation, choosing every detail with the care that came from understanding that spaces held power, the power to include or exclude, to elevate or diminish, to create belonging or enforce isolation. The Meridian. Heights Children's Foundation Gala would be Grandview Manor's grand reopening, the first major event in the newly restored ballroom. It would announce to the city's elite that a new standard of elegance had arrived, one that valued creativity and authenticity alongside traditional markers of success. It would also announce that Sophia Blackwell, the disappointing daughter, the family afterthought, the one who didn't quite belong, was now the creative director and part owner of the most exclusive venue in the city. My family had no idea. In all their careful social planning, in all their deliberate exclusions, they'd never bothered to ask what I'd been doing with my life beyond their dismissive assumptions. They knew I was still doing art things and living in that warehouse space and dating someone they'd never met because they'd never shown enough interest to be introduced. They had no idea that the warehouse space was a converted artist studio, worth more than their country club memberships. They had no idea that my art things had evolved into a successful career with an international following. And they definitely had no idea that the man they'd refused to acknowledge was about to become their host for the evening. I pulled my phone out and scrolled to Elias's contact. His photo appeared on the screen. That moment I'd captured him laughing at something ridiculous I'd said during one of our planning sessions, natural and unguarded in a way that made my heart skip even now. I could call him, tell him what my family had done, ask him to add my name to their table to make space for me in the evening they'd planned without me, but that would make me a guest at my own event. That would make me dependent on his intervention to claim my rightful place. That would make me once again the person who needed to be accommodated rather than the person who belonged. Instead, I opened a new message and typed, "Looking forward to tomorrow night. It's going to be perfect." His response came back immediately. "It already is perfect, because you'll be there. Can't wait to see their faces." He knew. Not the details of tonight's discovery, but the broader pattern. He'd watched me navigate family, events where I was treated like a polite stranger, had seen the way my confidence dimmed whenever I talked about family gatherings, had noticed how I always seemed surprised when I was included in their plans rather than expectant. "They're going to have some adjustments to make," he'd said once, after I'd told him about yet another family gathering I'd learned about secondhand. When someone realizes they've been underestimating a Montenegro, things tend to get interesting. Tomorrow night was going to be very interesting indeed. I hung the Halston dress on the outside of my closet where I could see it, a reminder of the choice I'd made. No more accommodating their limitations. No more shrinking myself to fit their narrow definition of family. No more accepting their table scraps when I could set my own table. Tomorrow night, I would walk into Grandview Manor, not as the Blackwell family disappointment hoping for inclusion, but as Sophia Montenegro Blackwell, co-owner of the venue, creative, director of the restoration, and the woman who'd helped create the most elegant event space in the city. They wanted a perfect family evening without me? They were going to get exactly that. But it would be happening in my ballroom, according to my vision, under my rules. And for the first time in my adult life, they would be the ones hoping to belong. Saturday. Evening arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made Meridian Heights look like a postcard. I spent the afternoon at Grandview Manor, making final adjustments to the floral arrangements and ensuring every detail was perfect. The ballroom looked ethereal. Crystal chandeliers casting warm light over tables draped in champagne silk, centerpieces of white orchids and eucalyptus that I'd designed personally, and the restored murals on the ceiling that told the story of the manor's golden age. Everything was ready, including me. At 6:30 p.m., I stood in the bridal suite that Elias had converted into a private preparation room, applying the final touches of my makeup. The Halston dress fit like it had been made for me, the black silk moving with every breath, elegant and understated in a way that spoke of confidence rather than desperation for attention. My grandmother's pearl earrings, the only family heirloom I'd managed to claim before Victoria decided what was appropriate for each of us to inherit, caught the light as I turned my head. I looked like someone who belonged in ballrooms. More importantly, I felt like someone who owned them. Elias appeared in the doorway, devastating in his midnight blue tuxedo, custom-tailored to perfection. His bow tie was slightly crooked, a detail I'd come to love because it was the only thing about him that wasn't absolutely perfect. "Nervous?" he asked, though his eyes were already scanning my face for the answer. "Excited," I said, and meant it. "Are they here yet?" The Blackwell table arrived 15 minutes ago. They're in the cocktail reception, holding court near the east windows. He paused, studying my expression. "Your mother is wearing enough diamonds to fund a small country's defense budget." I laughed, despite myself. "That sounds like Catherine. She believes in making statements." "Tonight, we're the ones making statements," he said, crossing the room to straighten his bow tie in the mirror. "The staff knows to give them standard hospitality until you're ready. No special treatment, no recognition of their expectations. The Blackwell family was accustomed to being recognized wherever they went in Meridian Heights. My father's position on various boards, my mother's social connections, Victoria's marriage into old money, they expected doors to open, maitre d's to remember their preferences, and staff to treat them with the deference that came with being Local royalty. Tonight they would be just another table of donors. Important, certainly, but not more important than anyone else writing checks for charity. "How do they seem?" I asked, applying one final coat of lipstick, a shade called Confident, that I'd chosen specifically for tonight. "Smug," Elias said without hesitation. "Your sister keeps gesturing toward the ballroom like she's giving a tour. Your mother is evaluating everything with that expression people get when they're looking for flaws to discuss later. Your father seems uncomfortable." Dad's discomfort didn't surprise me. He'd always been the most aware of the family's treatment of me, even if he'd never been brave enough to intervene. He understood on some level that their systematic exclusion was wrong, but he'd chosen his wife's social ambitions over his daughter's feelings too many times to count. "And James?" I asked, referring to Victoria's husband. "Taking pictures of everything. I think he's documenting the evening for social media." Elias turned from the mirror and offered me his arm. "Ready to make your entrance?" I took his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him through the expensive fabric of his jacket. "More than ready." We walked through the service corridors that connected the private areas to the main reception space. These were the passages that allowed staff to move invisibly through the manor, the hidden infrastructure that made elegant events possible. Tonight, they felt like the corridors of a castle where the rightful queen was returning to claim her throne. The cocktail reception was in full swing when we reached the main entrance. Through the glass doors, I could see exactly what Elias had described. 200 of Meridian Heights' most influential people clustered in conversational groups, champagne glasses catching the light, the low hum of important people discussing important things. And there, near the east windows, exactly where Elias had said they'd be, was my family. My mother looked magnificent, I had to admit. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and she wore a navy blue dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, with a sapphire necklace that had belonged to my great-grandmother. She was holding court with Mrs. Pemberton and Mrs. Ashworth, two other society matrons whose approval could make or break social standing in our city. Victoria was beside her, radiant in pale gold, her blonde hair falling in perfect waves over one shoulder. She was indeed gesturing toward the ballroom, probably explaining the historical significance of the restoration to anyone who would listen, as if she'd been personally involved in the project. Dad stood slightly apart from the women, nursing what looked like his second scotch and wearing the expression of a man who would rather be anywhere else. James was indeed taking photos, documenting their presence at what would undoubtedly be the social event of the season. They looked perfect, complete, like the family portrait they'd always wanted to be. "Last chance to change your mind," Elias murmured beside me. "We could have you seated at the head table, avoid the confrontation entirely." I shook my head. "They need to face what they've done, and I need to stop hiding from who I've become." He squeezed my arm gently. "Then let's go remind them that every castle has a queen." We pushed through the glass doors, and I felt the change in the room immediately. Conversations paused as people noticed us. Not unusual, since Elias commanded attention wherever he went, but tonight felt different. Tonight, people were looking at me too, trying to place the elegant woman on the arm of their host. I'd been to events like this before, but always as the Blackwell family afterthought, always slightly behind or to the side, always forgettable. Tonight, I was walking through the center of the room with the confidence of someone who belonged here, and people were noticing. We moved through the crowd slowly, Elias stopping to greet key donors and thank major sponsors. I recognized many of the faces. These were people who'd known me peripherally for years, who'd seen me at various Blackwell family events but never thought to really look at me. Tonight, they were looking. "Sophia?" Mrs. Pemberton's voice carried, across the space between conversation groups. "Sophia Blackwell? My goodness. You look absolutely stunning." The woman who'd been deep in conversation with my mother was now staring at me with obvious surprise. Mrs. Pemberton had been to our house for dinner parties, had seen me at charity events, but clearly hadn't expected to encounter me here, looking like this, on the arm of the evening's host. "Hello, Mrs. Pemberton," I said smoothly, not stopping our progress through the room, but acknowledging her with a gracious smile. "What a lovely evening for the foundation." "Indeed. And you know Mr. Montenegro, of course. We're well acquainted," Elias said, his hand tightening slightly on my arm in a gesture of possession that wasn't lost on anyone watching. I could feel my family's attention like a spotlight now. In my peripheral vision, I saw Victoria's head, turned sharply in our direction, saw my mother's conversation falter as she registered my presence, saw my father's Scotch glass pause halfway to his lips. They'd seen me, seen us. And they were trying to process what they were witnessing, their disappointing daughter, the one they'd deliberately excluded from tonight's celebration, walking through their social event like she belonged here more than they did. We were still 20 feet away from their group when Victoria broke away from the conversation she'd been having and started walking toward us, her smile bright and brittle as spun sugar. "Sophia," she called out, loud enough for half the reception to hear. "What a surprise! I didn't realize you were coming tonight." Victoria's approach was strategic, calculated in the way that only someone raised in high society could manage. Her smile was camera-ready, her voice pitched at exactly the right volume to seem spontaneous, while ensuring maximum audience participation. She was attempting damage control before she even understood what damage needed controlling. "Sophia, darling," she repeated, reaching us with her arms extended as if we were long-lost sisters reuniting after years apart, rather than siblings who lived 20 minutes from each other. "You look absolutely gorgeous. That dress is stunning. Vintage, isn't it? So very you." There it was. The backhanded compliment wrapped in enthusiasm, designed to simultaneously acknowledge my appearance while subtly positioning it as somehow lesser than current fashion. Victoria was a master at this particular art form. "Thank you," I said calmly, accepting her air kisses without returning them. "Victoria, I'd like you to meet Elias Montenegro. Elias, this is my sister Victoria." Elias extended his hand with the kind of polished courtesy that came from years of international business dealings. "Mrs. Whitmore, I presume? I've heard so much about you." Victoria's smile flickered slightly as she shook his hand. She was clearly trying to place him, to understand who he was and why he mattered enough to be introduced so formally. The name Montenegro was vaguely familiar to her. She'd heard it in business circles, seen it in society pages, but she couldn't quite connect the dots. "And you are?" she asked, her tone still bright but with an underlying edge of confusion. "Elias Montenegro," he said simply, as if the name should mean something, which in hospitality circles it absolutely did. "Montenegro," Victoria repeated. Her social autopilot engaged while her brain worked frantically to process the information. "That name sounds familiar. Are you in business here in Meridian Heights?" Behind her, I could see my parents approaching. My mother moved with the kind of purposeful grace that indicated she'd decided to take control of whatever situation was developing. My father followed a step behind, looking like a man walking toward his own execution. "Something like that," Elias replied diplomatically. "I work in hospitality." The understatement was deliberate. Elias didn't just work in hospitality, he was hospitality royalty, heir to an empire that spanned 3 continents. But he was letting Victoria dig her own grave with assumptions. "How lovely." Victoria's voice had taken on the particular tone she used when she was being polite to service industry workers. "And how did you and Sophia meet? Through one of her art things?" "My art things." Even now, even faced with evidence that I moved in circles she hadn't anticipated, Victoria couldn't bring herself to take my career seriously. "Actually," Elias said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement, "Sophia was commissioned to create pieces for one of my properties, Her work is quite remarkable, internationally recognized, in fact. Victoria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This was not going according to her script. In her version of this encounter, she would graciously acknowledge my presence, introduce me to her social circle as the artistic sister with the interesting bohemian lifestyle, and then smoothly redirect attention back to more important matters. Mother. Dad, I said as they reached our small group. I'd like you to meet Elias Montenegro. My mother extended her hand with the kind of regal bearing she'd perfected over decades of social events. Mr. Montenegro, how nice to meet you. I'm Catherine Blackwell, and this is my husband Richard. Mrs. Blackwell, Elias said, taking her hand and executing a small bow that was perfectly European and utterly charming. What a pleasure. Sophia speaks of you often. I wondered what exactly my mother was hearing in that statement. Probably something complimentary, knowing her capacity for selective interpretation. And what brings you to our little charity gala? My mother asked, clearly positioning herself as somehow responsible for the evening's festivities. Our little charity gala, I repeated silently to myself, marveling at her ability to claim ownership of events she'd simply purchased tickets to attend. Well, Elias said, glancing at me with eyes that sparkled with barely contained mischief. I suppose you could say I have a personal interest in the venue. Around us, I could sense other conversations beginning to pause. Mrs. Pemberton had moved closer, clearly eavesdropping. The Ashworths had angled themselves to better hear our exchange. In the way of all social gatherings, word was beginning to spread that something interesting was happening near the east windows. The venue is spectacular, my father said, speaking for the first time since joining our group. The restoration work is incredible. Whoever managed this project has exquisite taste. Why, thank you, I said quietly. That's very kind. Dad looked at me with confusion. I'm sorry? The restoration, I clarified, my voice still soft but carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen around us. I managed the artistic direction for the project. The silence that followed was the kind that makes people unconsciously hold their breath. Victoria's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. My mother's smile froze in place. My father blinked, rapidly, as if trying to clear his vision. You... what? Victoria finally managed. The murals on the ceiling, the color palette, the integration of historical elements with contemporary design. That was my work, I explained, still in that same calm conversational tone. It's been quite a project. 18 months from concept to completion. Mrs. Pemberton stepped closer, no longer pretending she wasn't listening. You designed all this? My dear, it's absolutely breathtaking. Thank you, I said, accepting the compliment with the grace of someone accustomed to professional recognition. Though I certainly couldn't have done it without an incredible team. But how did you... my mother began, then stopped, clearly, struggling to formulate a question that wouldn't reveal her complete ignorance of my professional life. How did I get involved in a project of this scale? I finished gently. Well, it started when Elias commissioned me to create sculptural pieces for the lobby renovation. From there, it evolved into a broader creative partnership. Partnership? Victoria's voice had gone up half an octave. Elias smiled, and I could see he was enjoying this almost as much as I was. Sophia has been instrumental in transforming Grandview Manor into what you see tonight. Her vision, her artistic sense, she's made this place something truly special. But who owns the property? My father asked, clearly trying to understand the power dynamics at play. In his world, ownership was everything. I heard it had been purchased by some international consortium. Montenegro Holdings, Elias said. Simply, my family's company. The pieces were starting to click into place. I could see the recognition dawning in my mother's eyes, the understanding that the name Montenegro wasn't just familiar, it was significant. Montenegro Holdings, she repeated slowly. The hotel chain? Among other things, Elias confirmed modestly. But that means… Victoria started, then stopped, her face going pale as the full implications hit her. That means, I said, deciding it was time to put them out of their misery, that tonight's gala is being held in a venue that I helped design, managed by the company owned by my fiancé. The word fiancé hit the group like a small explosion. Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor with a crystalline crash that seemed to echo through the sudden silence. My mother's hand flew to her throat, instinctively grasping for her necklace. My father's face went through a series of expressions that would have been comical under different circumstances. Around us, the growing audience was no longer pretending not to listen. The Blackwell family drama was becoming the evening's entertainment. Fiancé? My mother whispered, as if the word itself might be contagious. We haven't made a formal announcement yet, I said, looking up at Elias with genuine affection. We wanted to wait until after the Manor's grand reopening. Tonight seemed like the perfect occasion. Elias lifted my left hand to his lips and kissed the vintage emerald engagement ring that had belonged to his grandmother, a detail my family was only now noticing. So when you said you had a personal interest in the venue, my father began. I meant that I own it, Elias finished simply. And that my fiancé designed it. The silence stretched out like a taut wire, broken only by the distant sound of the orchestra tuning their instruments in the ballroom. Around us, I could hear whispered conversations beginning, as the implications of what they'd just witnessed spread through the cocktail reception like wildfire. Victoria was the first to recover her voice. "Why didn't you tell us?" she demanded, her composure finally cracking. "Why didn't you say anything about any of this?" I looked at her for a long moment, then at my parents, and finally back at Victoria. "When would I have told you?" I asked quietly. "At the family dinners I wasn't invited to? The holiday gatherings I found out about on Instagram? The birthday? Celebrations where you forgot to set a place for me?" The accusation hung in the air between us, impossible to deny because it was simply, factually true. The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and impossible to ignore. My mother's face had gone through several shades of pale, settling on a sickly ivory that matched her pearls. Victoria was staring at me as if I'd suddenly started speaking in tongues, while my father looked like a man who'd just realized he'd been playing poker with someone who'd been counting cards the entire time. "Sophia," my mother began, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining composure in front of an audience that now included half the gala's attendees. "Surely you understand that we never meant… Never meant what exactly?" I interrupted, my voice still calm but carrying a steel edge that I'd learned from watching Elias negotiate multi-million-dollar deals. "Never meant to exclude me? Never meant to plan family gatherings without me? Never meant to assume I had nothing worthwhile to contribute to conversations about art or business or anything that mattered to you?" Mrs. Pemberton shifted closer, her social antenna fully extended. The Ashworths had abandoned all pretense of having their own conversation. Even James had stopped taking photos, too transfixed by the unfolding drama to remember his documentation duties. "We always assumed you preferred your independent lifestyle," Victoria said, grasping for some explanation that wouldn't make them look like the architects of a decades-long campaign of systematic dismissal. "You never seemed interested in our world." "Your world," I repeated, letting the word settle. "You mean the world of charity galas and cultural events and supporting the arts?" "The world I've been working in professionally for the past 5 years." Elias stepped slightly forward, his presence both protective and amplifying. "Perhaps this would be a good time to mention that Sophia's pieces are currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The exhibition opened last month." The intake of breath from our growing audience was audible. The Metropolitan wasn't just any museum. It was the museum, the gold standard of artistic achievement. Having work displayed there was the kind of accomplishment that defined careers. Met? Mrs. Ashworth's voice carried across the space between conversation groups. Sophia, my dear, why didn't you tell us? That's extraordinary. Tell you when? I asked, genuine curiosity in my voice. At the country club events I wasn't invited to? The dinner parties where my name wasn't on the guest list? My father cleared his throat, a sound that usually preceded his attempts to smooth over family tensions. Sophia, we had no idea you were working at that level. If we'd known, you'd have what? I asked, turning to face him directly. Suddenly remembered you had 2 daughters instead of 1. Started including me in family photos? Actually asked me about my life instead of making assumptions about what I was doing with it? The crowd around us had grown larger, drawn by the kind of family drama that made social events memorable. I could see phones being discreetly positioned for recording, though no one was bold enough to be obvious about it. This conversation would be dissected in drawing rooms across Meridian Heights for months to come. The truth is, I continued, my voice carrying clearly in the marble and crystal acoustics of the reception hall, you never bothered to learn what my independent lifestyle actually consisted of because it was easier to assume I was still the disappointing daughter who chose art school over business. Elias reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone, scrolling to something before handing it to my father. This might interest you, Mr. Blackwell. It's the profile Forbes ran on Sophia last month. Rising stars in contemporary sculpture, artists reshaping cultural landscapes. My father's face went through a fascinating series of expressions as he read. Victoria peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening with each line. My mother stood frozen, as if movement might somehow make the situation worse. Forbes? Victoria whispered. You were profiled in Forbes? The business and arts crossover piece, I confirmed. They were interested in artists who were building sustainable careers while maintaining creative integrity. Apparently, my approach to combining fine art with architectural consultation was worth covering. Mrs. Pemberton was practically vibrating with excitement. Catherine, you must be so proud. A daughter in Forbes, work at the Met, designing venues like this. She is proud. Elias interjected smoothly before my mother could respond. Though I think the family has been so busy with their own accomplishments that they haven't had time to properly celebrate Sophia's. It was a masterful diplomatic deflection, giving my mother a face-saving explanation for her ignorance while simultaneously highlighting exactly how absent they'd been from my life. The gallery in Portland where my work is represented, I continued, deciding to paint the full picture, has been trying to arrange a showing here in Meridian Heights. They thought it would be meaningful for me to have a homecoming exhibition to show my work to the community where I grew up. Victoria looked hopeful for a moment, as if this might be information she could work with, a way to insert herself into my narrative. But I kept declining, I added, watching her face fall. I told them I wasn't sure there was enough local interest in my work to justify the investment. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses. This one carried weight, implication, understanding from our audience about exactly what I was saying. Of course, my mother said quickly, we would have supported an exhibition. We would have been delighted to— Would you? I asked gently. Because when the gallery reached out to you directly 6 months ago, asking if you'd consider hosting a private viewing for collectors, you told them you weren't sure my work would be suitable for your social circle. My mother's face went ashen. Victoria's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. My father stared at his shoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. They called you? Victoria finally managed. They call families, I explained. It's standard practice when organizing exhibitions. They like to involve local connections, especially when the artist has prominent family members who might help with promotion and sales. Mrs. Ashworth was shaking her head in what looked like genuine dismay. Catherine, surely there was some misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, I said clearly. My mother told them that while they were sure my work was very nice, they didn't think it would resonate with their friends' tastes. She suggested they try the community college gallery instead. The community college gallery. The insult hung in the air like a slap. Even people who knew nothing about the art world understood the hierarchy being referenced, the difference between a respected commercial gallery and a community college display space. I also declined the invitation to show at the Venice Biennale, I continued, my voice conversational as if I were discussing the weather. My representative thought it might conflict with family obligations here. Venice Biennale. The words rippled through our audience like a stone thrown into still water. Even people who weren't particularly cultured knew that name, knew it represented the absolute pinnacle of international artistic achievement. The Venice Biennale invited you? My father's voice was barely above a whisper. For their emerging artist pavilion, I confirmed. But it would have meant spending several months in Italy during the preparation period, and I paused, letting the moment build. I thought family should come first. The irony was exquisite, and everyone present understood it perfectly. I had turned down one of the most prestigious opportunities in the art world out of consideration, for a family that had systematically excluded me from their lives. Victoria was staring at me as if I'd suddenly sprouted wings. You turned down Venice? For us? For family obligations that, as it turned out, didn't actually include me, I said simply. Elias stepped closer, his hand finding the small of my back in a gesture of support that was both intimate and protective. The invitation stands, by the way. The Biennale committee was understanding about the delay. They're hoping Sophia will participate in next year's event. Assuming, I added, looking directly at my parents, that there are no conflicting family obligations to consider. The challenge in those words was unmistakable. I was giving them a choice, right here in front of 200 of the most influential people in Meridian Heights. They could continue to treat me as an afterthought, or they could finally acknowledge what I'd become. The silence stretched out like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point, everyone waiting to see which direction it would snap. The silence was becoming unbearable, thick with the weight of revelations and the growing realization among our audience that they were witnessing something far more significant than ordinary family tension. My mother's face had taken on the waxy quality of someone in shock, while Victoria kept glancing around as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist in front of 200 witnesses. It was my father who finally broke, his voice cracking slightly as he said, "Sophia, we had no idea. If we'd known about your success, about these opportunities—" You'd have what, Dad? I asked, but my tone had shifted. The diplomatic restraint I'd maintained was beginning to fray, revealing something sharper underneath. You'd have suddenly started including me? Started treating me like family instead of an inconvenience you had to manage? I reached into my evening clutch, a vintage Judith Lieber piece that had cost more than Victoria's monthly car payment, and withdrew my phone. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that whatever was coming next would be significant. Because here's what you really need to understand, I said, scrolling through my photos until I found what I was looking for. This wasn't just neglect. This wasn't just oversight or poor communication. I held up my phone, showing a screenshot of a text message thread. The timestamp was clearly visible, 3 weeks ago. The names at the top read Blackwell Family Planning and showed 4 participants. 4. This is your family group chat, I announced, my voice carrying clearly across the reception hall. The one you created to coordinate tonight's attendance. The one that includes Mom, Dad, Victoria, and James. The one I was never added to, despite the fact that you've had this chat for 8 months. Victoria's face had gone from pale to green. Sophia, you don't understand. No, I understand perfectly, I interrupted, swiping to the next screenshot. This is from 2 weeks ago, when you were discussing what to wear tonight. Victoria wrote, "Thank God we don't have to worry about Sophia showing up in one of her weird vintage outfits and embarrassing us in front of the Ashworths. Mrs. Ashworth made a small sound of dismay. The growing crowd murmured with uncomfortable recognition of the cruelty in those words. And this, I continued, swiping again, is Mom's response. Sometimes I think she does it deliberately, choosing to be difficult. At least tonight we can enjoy ourselves without having to manage her mood. My mother's hand flew to her throat, her diamond necklace catching the light as her fingers trembled. Where did you get those? James sent them to me, I said simply, looking at my brother-in-law, whose face had turned scarlet. Last week, along with an apology and an explanation that he'd been feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the family's treatment of me. James stepped forward, his voice barely audible. Sophia, I told you that in confidence. Did you? I asked mildly. Because I don't recall asking you to keep their cruelty secret. I recall you finally developing a conscience about participating in it. I swiped to another screenshot, this one showing a longer conversation thread. This is particularly interesting. It's from 6 months ago, right after the Forbes article came out. Victoria wrote, "Did you see that ridiculous piece about Sophia? Since when is she some kind of art world success story? Someone should tell the journalist they got their facts wrong." The crowd was no longer pretending not to listen. This had become the evening's main entertainment, a real-time demolition of one of Meridian Heights' most prominent families. And Dad's response, I continued, my voice steady despite the pain these words still caused. We should probably not mention the Forbes thing at the club. People might get the wrong impression about her actual importance. My father looked like he might be sick. Sophia, those were private conversations. About your private daughter, I said, the edge in my voice becoming unmistakable. About the family member you were so ashamed of that you couldn't even acknowledge her professional achievements to your friends. I put my phone away and looked around at the faces surrounding us. Some horrified, some fascinated, all completely absorbed in the unfolding drama. But the text messages are just the beginning, I said, my voice dropping to a more intimate register that somehow carried even more clearly in the marble acoustics. Because this goes deeper than just group chats and social media snubs. Elias stepped closer, his presence both supportive and amplifying my authority in this moment. He knew what was coming next. We'd discussed this possibility, planned for it even. 3 months ago, I began, I received a very interesting phone call from the Meridian Heights Museum of Fine Arts. They wanted to discuss a potential major exhibition, a retrospective of contemporary artists with local connections. Mrs. Pemberton nodded enthusiastically. Oh yes, I heard about that. They're planning something quite ambitious for next spring. They are indeed, I agreed. And they specifically wanted to feature my work as the centerpiece of the exhibition. Not just include it, feature it. As in, my name would be on the promotional materials, the gallery guides, the press releases. Victoria was shaking her head slowly, as if she could somehow will this revelation out of existence. But they needed a local sponsor, I continued. Someone with community connections who could help with promotion and underwriting. Someone whose endorsement would signal to other potential donors that this was a worthwhile investment. The pieces were clicking into place for our audience. I could see the understanding dawning on faces throughout the crowd. They approached. The Blackwell Foundation, I said simply. My family's charitable organization. The one that supports arts education and cultural initiatives throughout the city. My father's scotch glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the marble floor with a sharp crack that seemed to echo in the sudden stillness. They were told, I continued, my voice now carrying the weight of absolute truth, that the Blackwell Foundation had no interest in supporting amateur local artists and that their money was better invested in established institutions with proven track records. The silence that followed was different from all the previous pauses. This wasn't shock or confusion. This was the collective intake of breath that comes when an audience realizes they're witnessing not just family drama, but active sabotage. They didn't just exclude me, I said, looking directly at my mother. They actively undermined me. They used their influence to ensure that opportunities didn't come my way, that recognition was withheld, that my own hometown would never see my work displayed in its most prestigious cultural venue. Mrs. Ashworth was staring at my mother with undisguised horror. "Catherine, surely that's not true?" "It's completely true," I said before my mother could formulate a response. "And it gets worse." I pulled out my phone again, this time opening an email thread that I'd saved specifically for this moment. This is correspondence between my gallery representative in Portland and several potential collectors here in Meridian Heights. Wealthy art enthusiasts who had expressed interest in purchasing my work after seeing pieces in other cities. I held up the phone so the nearest observers could see the formal business correspondence displayed on the screen. Each of these potential collectors was contacted by someone claiming to represent the Blackwell family, I continued. They were told that I was financially irresponsible and that purchasing my work would be throwing money away on family. Charity cases. The gasp from our audience was audible this time. This wasn't just exclusion or dismissal. This was active economic sabotage. 5 sales, I said, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. 5 major sales to collectors, who had the money and the interest, all of whom withdrew their offers after receiving those calls. Victoria was crying now, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "Sophia, you never meant to get caught," I corrected. "But James has been keeping records. Haven't you, James?" My brother-in-law nodded miserably. "I have copies of everything. The phone logs, the emails, the coordination between your mother and Victoria about which collectors to contact." The crowd was murmuring now, the implications of systematic financial sabotage sinking in. This wasn't just family cruelty. This was potentially illegal interference with business relationships. "So when you ask why I didn't tell you about my engagement, about my success, about my opportunities," I said, looking at each member of my family in turn, "understand that I learned not to trust you with information about my life because you've spent years using that information to hurt me." The truth hung in the air like a sword suspended over all of us, sharp and inescapable and absolutely damning. The weight of the evidence hung over our group like a storm cloud, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. The crowd had grown to include nearly half the gala's attendees, drawn by the kind of public reckoning that would be discussed in Meridian Heights social circles for decades. My family stood before me like defendants awaiting sentencing, and in many ways, that's exactly what they were. But even that's not the worst of it, I said, my voice carrying a finality that made everyone lean closer. Because all of that, the exclusion, the mockery, the financial sabotage, that was just them trying to keep me small. What I discovered 3 weeks ago was them actively trying to destroy me. Elias moved closer, his hand finding mine in a gesture of support that steadied me for what was coming next. He knew this part of the story, had helped me verify the information that I'd initially hoped was some kind of mistake. "James," I said, turning to my brother-in-law, "would you please share with everyone what you told me about the Whitmore Foundation's recent activities?" James looked like a man being asked to jump off a cliff, but he'd already crossed the Rubicon by providing me with evidence. There was no going back now. "The Whitmore Foundation," he began, his voice barely audible, "my family's charitable organization, was approached 4 months ago about funding an investigation into contemporary art fraud." The crowd stirred uneasily. Art fraud was serious business, the kind of accusation that could destroy careers and reputations permanently. "What kind of investigation?" Mrs. Pemberton asked, though something in her tone suggested she already suspected where this was heading. James swallowed hard. "An investigation into artists who might be misrepresenting their credentials or achievements to galleries and collectors." The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone present understood the implications of what he'd just revealed. And who suggested that such an investigation might be necessary? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Victoria, James whispered. Victoria suggested that there might be irregularities in some local artists' representations of their work. Victoria was no longer just crying, she was sobbing, her carefully constructed facade crumbling completely. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," she choked out. "It was just supposed to be a preliminary inquiry." "A preliminary inquiry into what, exactly?" I pressed, my voice as sharp as broken glass. "Into whether your exhibitions and sales were legitimate," she finally admitted. The collective gasp from our audience was audible. Accusing an artist of fraud wasn't just cruel, it was career-ending. Even unfounded accusations could destroy professional relationships and gallery representation permanently. They wanted to investigate whether I had actually created the work attributed to me, I explained to the crowd, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. Whether my exhibition history was fabricated, whether collectors were being deceived about the authenticity and provenance of pieces they'd purchased. Mrs. Ashworth's hand flew to her chest. "But that would be fraud," I finished. "Yes. If proven, it would be criminal fraud punishable by significant jail time and civil penalties. It would also mean that every gallery that had represented me, every collector who had purchased my work, every museum that had displayed it would be complicit in a massive deception." The implications rippled through the crowd like shock waves. This wasn't just family drama. This was attempted destruction of my entire professional life and reputation. The investigation was to be conducted quietly, I continued, with findings shared with relevant galleries, museums, and collectors as warranted. If evidence of fraud was discovered, the information would be provided to law enforcement. Elias stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to dealing with high-stakes business matters. What they didn't count on was that the art world is smaller than they realized. When you start asking questions about an artist's legitimacy, word gets around. Fast. "My gallery representative in Portland received a call 3 weeks ago," I said, "from an investigator asking about documentation for my exhibitions. They wanted authentication records, purchase agreements, communications with museums, everything. That would prove my career was real." I pulled out my phone one final time, opening an email that had arrived that morning. "This is from the director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, sent this morning after they received similar inquiries. They wanted to confirm that there were no questions about the authenticity of my work before finalizing plans for the spring exhibition expansion." The crowd was completely silent now, understanding that they were witnessing the exposure of something truly malicious. 20 years of building a career," I said, my voice carrying the weight of that timeline. 20 years of creating, exhibiting, building relationships with galleries and collectors and curators, and my own family tried to destroy it all with anonymous accusations of fraud. My mother finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Sophia, you have to understand." "Understand what?" I cut her off. "Understand that you were so threatened by my success that you were willing to have me investigated for crimes I didn't commit? Understand that you preferred to see me in prison rather than acknowledge that I'd achieved something you couldn't control?" The truth of it hung in the air like poison gas, toxic and undeniable. "But here's what you didn't understand," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "When you launch a fraud investigation, the investigators don't just look at the accused. They look at the accusers. They want to understand motivation, potential conflicts of interest, reasons why someone might make false claims." Victoria's sobbing intensified. She clearly knew where this was going. "The investigation firm you hired spent 2 weeks documenting my credentials," I said. "And then they spent another 2 weeks investigating why the Blackwell and Whitmore families might want to destroy my reputation. I looked directly at my mother. They found the blocked museum exhibition. They found the interference with collectors. They found the systematic exclusion from family events. They found evidence of a years-long campaign to undermine my career. James stepped forward again, his voice stronger now. The investigation firm contacted me directly, he said. They wanted to know if I had any evidence of coordination between family members to damage Sophia's reputation or financial prospects. And what did you tell them? Mrs. Pemberton asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. I told them the truth, James replied. I provided them with documentation of everything. The group chats, the phone calls to collectors, the coordination, with the foundation, all of it. I smiled for the first time since this conversation had begun, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. So now there are 2 investigations running simultaneously. One into whether I committed fraud, which concluded that I'm exactly who I claim to be, and one into whether my family committed conspiracy, defamation, and intentional interference with business relationships. The color drained from my father's, conspiracy? 3 or more people working together to commit illegal acts, Elias explained helpfully. In this case, coordinated efforts to damage someone's professional reputation and financial prospects through false statements and deliberate interference. The investigation firm was very thorough, I continued. They found evidence of coordination between Mom, Victoria, and the family foundations. They documented the financial harm caused by interference with collectors. They established a pattern of systematic sabotage spanning several years. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Their report was submitted to the district attorney's office this morning, I announced, along with a recommendation that charges be filed for conspiracy, defamation, and intentional interference with prospective economic advantage. The silence that followed was complete. Not just quiet. The kind of absolute silence that comes when everyone present realizes they've witnessed something that will change lives forever. Victoria was hyperventilating now, her breathing shallow and rapid. My mother had gone completely still, as if movement might somehow make the situation worse. My father looked like he was calculating the cost of legal defense attorneys. So, when you ask why I didn't tell you about my engagement, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the stunned reception hall, understand that I've learned not to share good news with people who will use it to hurt me. And when you wonder why you weren't included in my success, remember that you chose to try to destroy it rather than celebrate it. I looked around at the faces surrounding us, 200 of Meridian Heights' most influential people who had just witnessed the complete destruction of one of their most prominent families. The gala will continue as planned, I announced to the crowd. The Children's Foundation will receive their donations, and everyone will have a lovely evening. But the Blackwell family's participation in tonight's festivities has come to an end. The security team moved with the kind of professional discretion that only came from years of handling delicate situations for high-profile clients. They appeared at my family's shoulders like shadows materializing from the marble walls, their presence unmistakable but not threatening. Elias had summoned them with nothing more than a subtle nod, a prearranged signal we'd discussed but never thought we'd actually need to use. Ladies and gentlemen, the head of security said quietly, his voice pitched to Carrie just far enough. If you'd please come with us, we have a private exit prepared. My mother drew herself up with the kind of dignity that only comes from a lifetime of believing your social position makes you untouchable. This is ridiculous. We purchased tickets to this event. We have every right to be here. Actually, Elias said, his voice carrying the calm authority of ownership, this is a private venue, and as the proprietor, I have the right to refuse service to anyone, particularly those who have demonstrated a pattern of harassment toward my staff. The word staff hung in the air like a perfectly aimed dart. To the crowd of onlookers, it was clear that he was referring to me, not as a family member seeking inclusion, but as a professional colleague who deserved protection from abusive behavior. Victoria looked around desperately, as if she might find some ally in the crowd of people who had just witnessed her family's complete moral destruction. Elias, surely we can work this out. We're reasonable people. Reasonable people, I said quietly. Don't spend years systematically trying to destroy their daughter's career and reputation. The security team began moving my family toward a service exit that would allow them to leave without having to walk through the crowd of gala attendees. It was a mercy they didn't deserve, but one that Elias was extending for the sake of the evening's other guests. As they were escorted away, I heard my father's voice for the last time that evening. Sophia, we can fix this. We can make it right. I didn't turn around. I didn't respond. Some things, once broken, couldn't be repaired with apologies and promises. The crowd that had gathered to witness our family's implosion began to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones. That would undoubtedly continue through dinner and long into the evening. I could already imagine the phone calls that would happen tomorrow, the social media posts that would carefully avoid mentioning specifics while making it clear that something significant had occurred. Mrs. Pemberton approached first, her face a mixture of sympathy and fascination. "My dear," she said, taking my hands in hers, "I had no idea what you were going through. The strength it must have taken to build your career while dealing with that kind of interference." "Thank you," I said simply. There wasn't much else to say. The truth had been told, the consequences were unfolding, and now it was time to move forward. The orchestra began playing in the ballroom, a signal that dinner would be served soon. The evening's program would continue as planned. The Children's Foundation would receive their donations, speeches would be made about supporting young artists and arts education, and 200 influential people would enjoy an elegant meal in a venue that I had helped create. But everything was different now. I was no longer the Blackwell family disappointment hoping for inclusion. I was Sophia Montenegro Blackwell, co-owner of the most prestigious venue in the city, internationally recognized artist, and the woman who had just orchestrated the social destruction of one of Meridian Heights' most prominent families. "Shall we go into dinner?" Elias asked, offering me his arm. I took it, feeling the solid warmth of him through his tuxedo jacket. I think that would be perfect. We walked through the crowd toward the ballroom, and I noticed something that would have been impossible an hour earlier. People moved aside for us, not reluctantly, but with the kind of respect accorded to hosts and important guests. Conversations paused as we passed, not with the uncomfortable silence of witnesses to family drama, but with the acknowledgement of people who understood they were in the presence of someone who commanded respect. The ballroom was magnificent. The restoration had taken 18 months, but seeing it filled with elegantly dressed guests under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers made every hour of work worthwhile. The murals I had overseen gleamed on the restored ceiling, telling stories of the manor's golden age while promising new chapters yet to be written. Our table was at the front of the room, positioned to overlook the entire gathering. As we took our seats, I noticed something that made me smile for the first time that evening. The Blackwell family table, the one they had reserved for 4 people, deliberately excluding me, sat empty now, its pristine place settings untouched, 4 chairs pushed back at angles that suggested hasty departure. The irony was perfect. They had planned their evening so carefully, made sure their family table reflected exactly the composition they preferred. And now their perfect arrangement was a monument to their absence, a visible reminder to everyone present of the consequences of their choices. "Do you have any regrets?" Elias asked quietly as the first course was served. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret exposing my family's systematic cruelty in front of 200 people? Did I regret the legal consequences they would face? Did I regret the end of any possibility of reconciliation? "No," I said finally. "For the first time in my adult life, I don't have to pretend that their behavior is acceptable." I don't have to make excuses for why I'm excluded, or minimize the damage they've caused, or hope that maybe next time will be different. The dinner conversation at our table was lively and engaging. The other guests, collectors, philanthropists, cultural leaders, wanted to know about my work, my upcoming exhibitions, my plans for future projects. For the first time at a Meridian Heights social event, I was included not as someone's disappointing relative, but as someone worth knowing in my own right. During the speech portion of the evening, when the Foundation's director spoke about the importance of supporting young artists and ensuring that talent was recognized regardless of background or family connections, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The Foundation would receive record donations tonight, funding programs that would help other young artists avoid the kind of systematic undermining I had experienced. When the evening began to wind down, guests approached our table to say goodbye and express their admiration for the venue. Several mentioned that they had been unaware of my artistic work and would be reaching out to my gallery. Others spoke about the importance of supporting local talent and how pleased they were to learn about my international recognition. Mrs. Ashworth was among the last to leave. She stopped at our table, her expression thoughtful. "Sophia, I want you to know that what happened tonight, what your family did to you, it's not representative of this community. We value artists here. We value talent and creativity and dedication." "Thank you," I said. "That means a great deal. I hope you'll consider that exhibition at the local museum," she continued. "I think our community would benefit greatly from seeing your work." After the last guests had departed, Elias and I stood alone in the empty ballroom. The staff was quietly clearing tables and resetting the space, but they moved around us with the kind of respectful distance that allowed for private conversation. "So," he said, pulling me close, "how does it feel to own the room instead of hoping to be allowed into it?" I looked around at the space we had created together. The restored murals, the elegant lighting, the evidence of vision and hard work and artistic integrity made manifest. "It feels like coming home," I said. "Finally." Outside, Meridian Heights glittered in the darkness, the same city where I had grown up feeling like I never quite belonged. But tonight, everything had changed. Tonight, I had claimed my place not by forcing my way into spaces that didn't want me, but by creating spaces beautiful enough that everyone wanted to be included. Tomorrow, the consequences of tonight's revelations would begin to unfold. Legal proceedings would commence, social structures would shift, and my family would face the reality of a world where their behavior had consequences. But tonight, standing in the ballroom I had helped design, surrounded by the evidence of my success and the warmth of genuine respect, I finally understood what belonging felt like. It wasn't about earning inclusion in someone else's vision. It was about creating something so beautiful, so undeniably valuable, that exclusion became impossible. 6 months later, I'm writing this from my studio in the restored East Wing of Grandview Manor, sunlight streaming through the tall windows that overlook the gardens where Elias and I will be married next spring. The space is exactly what I always dreamed of: high ceilings, perfect natural light, and enough room to work on the large-scale pieces that have become my signature. But more than that, it's a place where I belong completely, where my presence is wanted and valued and celebrated. The legal proceedings concluded last month. My family avoided criminal charges through a plea agreement that required public apologies, financial restitution for the sales they had sabotaged, and a prohibition on any future interference with my professional activities. The Blackwell Foundation was restructured under independent oversight, and Victoria was required to complete 200 hours of community service with arts organizations. A particularly fitting consequence that forces her to support the very community she tried to undermine. More importantly, the art world rallied around me in ways I never could have anticipated. The Venice Biennale invitation was renewed with enthusiasm, and my upcoming exhibition there will feature pieces inspired by the experience of building a career despite systematic family sabotage. The Metropolitan Museum extended my show by 6 months due to popular demand, and galleries from London to Tokyo have reached out about representing my work. But perhaps the most meaningful change is happening right here in Meridian Heights. The museum exhibition that my family's foundation once blocked is now scheduled to open in the fall, with sponsorship from 3 other family foundations who wanted to demonstrate their support for local artists. The opening reception will be held here at Grandview Manor, and I've been asked to speak about the importance of supporting emerging talent, regardless of family connections or social expectations. Mrs. Ashworth, who has become an unexpected ally and friend, serves on the exhibition planning committee. She told me recently that what happened at the gala last fall has sparked conversations throughout Meridian Heights about how the community treats its artists and whether social hierarchies sometimes prevent recognition of genuine talent. "You changed something that night," she said during one of our planning meetings, "not just for yourself, but for everyone who's ever been told they don't belong in spaces they helped create. The transformation in my relationship with the community has been remarkable. People who once saw me as the Blackwell family disappointment now seek me out at events, ask about my work, and include me in conversations about cultural initiatives and arts funding. I'm no longer someone who has to fight for a seat at the table. I'm someone who gets asked to help design the table itself. But the most profound change has been internal. For 28 years, I carried the weight of their rejection like a stone in my chest, always wondering if maybe they were right, maybe I wasn't quite good enough, maybe I was the problem in our family dynamic. The night of the gala didn't just expose their systematic cruelty, it freed me from the burden of believing their narrative about my worth. I used to think strength meant enduring their treatment silently, absorbing their dismissals and exclusions without complaint. I thought love meant accepting scraps of attention and being grateful for minimal inclusion. I thought family meant tolerating abuse because blood relations somehow excused systematic undermining. I was wrong about all of it. Real strength isn't silent endurance. It's having the courage to expose truth even when it's uncomfortable. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others comfortable. And real family doesn't need to destroy one member's success to feel secure about their own worth. The night I walked into that gala, I thought I was just confronting my family's latest exclusion. I didn't realize I was walking toward the first day of a life where I would never again apologize for taking up space, never again make myself smaller to accommodate someone else's insecurity, never again accept treatment that I wouldn't tolerate from strangers. Elias and I often talk about the psychological dynamics of exclusion and belonging. He's seen it in business, the way insecure people try to maintain control by keeping others out, the way threatened individuals sabotage colleagues rather than celebrate shared success. But he's also seen the power that comes from building something so valuable that exclusion becomes impossible. "The beautiful thing about what you did," he told me recently, "is that you didn't just fight back against their treatment. You built something they couldn't ignore or undermine. You made yourself undeniable." That's the word that stays with me. Undeniable. Not because I forced my way into their spaces, but because I created value that transcended their small-minded hierarchies. Not because I demanded recognition, but because I built a body of work that spoke for itself. Not because I fought for inclusion, but because I established my own authority. The wedding planning has been an interesting exercise in boundary setting. My family was not invited. That decision wasn't made in anger or spite. It was made from a place of clarity about what I will and won't accept in my life going forward. People who spend years trying to destroy your career and reputation don't get to attend celebrations of your happiness. Some people have suggested that forgiveness would be the bigger response, that family reconciliation would demonstrate maturity and growth. But I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require ongoing relationship with people who have proven themselves untrustworthy. You can release anger without inviting continued abuse. You can choose healing without choosing reconciliation. The guest list for our wedding reads like a celebration of chosen family. Artists who supported my work when galleries were hesitant, collectors who believed in my vision before it was commercially successful, friends who celebrated my achievements when my blood relatives were trying to undermine them. Mrs. Ashworth will be there, along with the museum director and several gallery owners who have become genuine friends over the years. It will be a small ceremony, maybe 50 people, held in the gardens where Elias first told me he loved not just me, but the way I saw beauty in everything around us. The guest list represents relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation or social positioning. Sometimes people ask if I miss my family, if there are moments when I regret the definitive end of those relationships. The honest answer is that I miss the family I thought I had, the one where love was unconditional and support was guaranteed. But that family never actually existed. It was a story I told myself to make their treatment bearable. What I don't miss is the constant uncertainty, the walking on eggshells, the hope followed by inevitable disappointment. I don't miss checking my phone for invitations that never came, or making excuses for exclusions that were deliberate. I don't miss the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who had already decided I wasn't worth their effort. Instead, I wake up every morning in a space I helped create, surrounded by work that reflects my vision and values, planning projects with people who respect my judgment and celebrate my success. I spend my days making beautiful things with someone who sees my achievements as reasons for pride rather than threats to manage. This is what belonging actually feels like. Not the desperate hope for inclusion, but the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth isn't dependent on other people's recognition. So if you're watching this and you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong in your own family, if you've ever had your achievements dismissed or your worth questioned by people who should have been your biggest supporters, I want you to understand something. Their inability to value you says nothing about your actual worth and everything about their capacity for love. You don't have to earn belonging from people who are determined to exclude you. You don't have to prove your worth to people who are invested in believing you're worthless. You don't have to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were designed to be too small for you. Instead, build something so beautiful, so valuable, so undeniably yours that exclusion becomes impossible. Create relationships based on mutual respect rather than familial obligation. Surround yourself with people who celebrate your success rather than sabotage it. The table they wouldn't make room for you at, build your own. Make it bigger, more beautiful, more welcoming than anything they could have offered. Then invite people who actually want to be there. Trust me, the view from your own table is much better than the view from the corner where they tried to keep you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? Have you ever discovered that the people who should have supported you were actually working against you? Tell me your story in the comments. I read every single one, and I want you to know that your voice matters, your worth is real, and your success is possible, regardless of who tries to stand in your way. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you that you deserve better than tolerance and scraps of affection, hit that subscribe button. Because building something beautiful out of broken family dynamics is just the beginning of what's possible when you finally decide you're worth fighting for. I'm standing in the sculpture garden behind our home. Yes, we bought the manor from Elias's family company, watching our 3-year-old daughter Elena chase butterflies between the bronze pieces I've created over the past few years. She has her father's dark hair and my stubborn independence, and she's never known a world where her mother's achievements were questioned or diminished. This morning, she helped me unveil my latest piece, a commission for the Meridian Heights Children's Hospital that took 18 months to complete. The dedication ceremony was attended by 300 people, including the mayor, the hospital board, and dozens of families whose children will see this sculpture during their treatments. Elena stood beside me, tiny hands clapping as the covering fell, a way to reveal a bronze tree with children's faces emerging from the branches, each one representing hope, resilience, and the beauty that can grow from difficult circumstances. "Mama made the tree people," she announced to anyone who would listen, her voice carrying the kind of pride that children have before they learn to hide their enthusiasm. Watching her beam at my work, seeing her assume that of course her mother creates beautiful things that matter to her community, I realize this is what I was fighting for that night at the gala. Not just my own recognition, but the right to build a legacy that my children could inherit with pride. The irony isn't lost on me that the commission came from the same hospital where Victoria now works as a volunteer coordinator, part of her ongoing community service that somehow became a genuine calling. We don't speak when our paths cross, but there's a mutual acknowledgement now, a recognition that we've both moved beyond the people we were that night. Last month, I received an unexpected letter. My father writing from the assisted living facility, where he moved after my mother's death 2 years ago, wanted to tell me about the newspaper clipping he keeps on his nightstand. It's from the Times review of my Venice Biennale exhibition, the one that called my work a profound meditation on resilience and the alchemy of transforming pain into beauty. "I read it every morning," he wrote in his careful script. "I know I have no right to be proud, but I am. I'm proud, and I'm sorry, and I understand now that those two things aren't enough. But I wanted you to know. I haven't responded yet. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. But the fact that he wrote it tells me something about the ripple effects of that night 5 years ago." Sometimes standing up for yourself doesn't just change your own life, it forces other people to confront the choices they've made and the people they've become. The Grandview Manor Foundation, which Elias and I established 3 years ago, has become one of the region's most influential arts organizations. We've funded 47 emerging artists, many of them dealing with family circumstances similar to what I experienced. There's something powerful about being able to tell young artists that their worth isn't determined by their family's support, that success is possible even when the people who should champion you choose to undermine you instead. One of our fellows, a painter named Marcus whose parents disowned him for choosing art over law school, just had his first solo show in New York. Another, a sculptor named Aria, whose family considered her work a waste of time, is now represented by galleries in 3 countries. When I see their success, I remember my own journey from the warehouse studio to international recognition, and I understand that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is proof that their dreams aren't impossible. Elena calls me over to see a caterpillar she's discovered on one of the rose bushes. "Look, Mama, it's going to be a butterfly." "How do you know?" I ask, crouching down to examine her find. "Because that's what caterpillars do," she says with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood. "They change into something beautiful." I think about transformations as we watch the tiny creature inch along the stem. 5 years ago, I walked into that gala as the Blackwell family disappointment, the daughter who never quite fit their image of success. I left as someone entirely different, not because they finally accepted me, but because I finally accepted myself. The woman who stood in that reception hall, desperate for inclusion in her family's perfect evening, doesn't exist anymore. She's been replaced by someone who understands that belonging isn't something you earn from people who are determined to exclude you. It's something you create for yourself and others who need it. Tonight, we're hosting our annual foundation gala here at the Manor. The guest list includes artists and collectors, philanthropists and community leaders, people who believe in supporting creativity regardless of family connections or social hierarchies. Elena will make an appearance before bedtime, charming everyone with her enthusiasm for Mama's art parties. Some of the guests will be people who were there that night 5 years ago, who witnessed the destruction of the Blackwell family's social standing and the birth of something new. Others will be meeting me for the first time, knowing me only as the internationally recognized artist who creates opportunities for others to follow similar paths. But for all of them, the story will be the same. Sometimes the people who try to keep you small end up proving how large you actually are. Sometimes the greatest gift your enemies give you is the motivation to build something they can't destroy. Sometimes the table you're not invited to is less important than the banquet you create for others. Elena has moved on from the caterpillar to a marble fountain where koi fish swim in lazy circles. She's naming each fish, creating elaborate stories about their adventures, building entire worlds with her imagination. Watching her, I see the kind of child I might have been if I'd grown up in a family that celebrated creativity instead of fearing it. She'll never know what it feels like to have her achievements dismissed or her worth questioned by the people who should love her most. She'll never have to choose between family approval and self-respect. She'll never have to build her success in spite of systematic undermining from the people who claim to want what's best for her. But she will know what it means to create something beautiful and meaningful. She will know what it feels like to have her work valued and celebrated. She will know that success is possible regardless of who tries to stand in your way. And maybe that's the real victory. Not just changing my own life, but ensuring that the next generation inherits a different story entirely. As the sun sets behind the trees we planted when Elena was born, I think about the letter from my father, still unanswered on my desk. Part of me wants to respond, to offer some kind of reconciliation or forgiveness. But a larger part of me understands that some bridges, once burned, don't need to be rebuilt. The life I've built, with Elias, with Elena, with the community of artists and supporters who believe in beauty and creativity and the radical act of supporting someone else's dreams, this life is complete without their approval. It's better without their interference. It's more authentic without their conditional love. Elena runs back to me, grass stains on her white dress, flowers in her hair, eyes bright with the kind of joy that comes from knowing you're exactly where you belong. "Mama," she says, "when I grow up, can I make beautiful things too?" "Sweetheart," I tell her, lifting her into my arms, "you already do." Behind us, the manor glows in the golden hour light, its restored windows reflecting the gardens, where we've built our life. In a few hours, it will fill with people who understand that art matters, that creativity should be celebrated, that success should be shared rather than hoarded. But for now, it's just us, a family that chose each other, in a home that we created, surrounded by beauty that we built together. It's everything I never knew I wanted when I was still hoping for scraps from a table that was never meant to include me. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's building something so beautiful that your enemy's absence becomes a gift instead of a loss. And sometimes, the family you create is infinitely more valuable than the family you were born into. Elena is already planning tomorrow's garden adventures, her voice carrying across the evening air as she describes the fairy houses she wants to build and the flowers she wants to plant. Her future stretches ahead of her, bright with possibility, unmarked by the kind of systematic undermining that once defined my own path. This is what victory looks like, not the destruction of your enemies, but the creation of a world where their opinion no longer matters. Not the moment they finally accept you, but the moment you realize their acceptance was never required. The caterpillar Elena discovered earlier has begun its journey toward transformation, wrapped now in the chrysalis that will reshape it completely. In a few weeks, it will emerge as something entirely new, not because it fought against its nature, but because it finally embraced it. Sometimes that's all any of us can do. Trust the process, embrace the transformation, and emerge as something more beautiful than anyone, including ourselves, ever imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.